recording. Cool, cool. Okay. Our favorite thing to do as we fumble around and get ready here is for everyone to drop where you are signing in from in the chat. We see familiar names and faces. And we're so excited to have you all here. Please mute yourself unless you're a speaker, and tell us where you're logging in from in the chat. I got a Portugal. Hello, Heather. I know who's there in Portugal. Hamburg, Pennsylvania, Oregon, Ukraine, France. This is fun. I love this part. Argentina. Very cool.
Very good.
Cool. Yeah, good. Great. We're going to get started in just a moment. Let me see here. Valentina, it looks like, is your picture connecting? And would you like to share your slides, or do you still want me to run them for you?
It's taking a little bit to load on my computer with the video and slides. So if you don't mind, start with the slides for me. And as soon as my computer can switch to that.
Okay, no problem at all. I will do that. So I've pinned you. I'm going to pin myself for now, and I'm going to pin Miss Gabriela. There we go. Okay, we're all three pinned. Just before we get started, yeah, we're still kind of going around. Gabriela, are you running the admissions operation? You got that? Okay, cool. So welcome everyone to this really exciting subject that we are addressing today. We're pulling in some sociolinguistics, and if you're on our ILCA mailing list, you know why I am so excited about this and why I personally love sociolinguistics and the role that it's played in my career and in my personal life, as well as a multi-dialectical speaker. So if you're not on our mailing list, go to our website and join the mailing list so that you can stay up to date of other events like this. This is our first one for 2022. We're super excited for this Expert 2022 series, and we've changed the format a little bit, and we're doing it every other month now. So our next one will be in March. We're hoping we get some big turnouts for these. Hi, Valentina, I can see your face now, yay.
Excellent.
Yeah, so, and then on the month that we don't do it in February, we're going to feature a language coach. So anyone here, anyone today that wants to be featured and feel like you've got a great story that you are just like bursting at the seams to share with us, please write us info@internationallanguagecoaching.com. Let us know, tell me your story, tell me why you want to be featured, and we'll get you on there. We are also very open to guest blogging as well, and we'll share your blog and your contact information with our whole list and our entire network on social media and everything. What we want to do in 2022 is feature you, feature the language coaches, feature the people that are making ILCA. And then the last thing I'll say before I hand it over to Valentina is that we are building a global map and database of where all of our language coaches are, so that you may connect with one another. And as we continue to receive more and more requests for language coaches, that we can put potential, clients and would-be collaborators in touch with you. So look out for that. Again, mailing list. That's where that information lives. That's where you will find out about it. And you can get on that just by visiting our homepage, which we have dropped a link in, or will drop a link into the chat. This talk, if you're watching this, then that means you already got there. But if you want to watch it again and you're here now, it's going to be on our YouTube. So hello, YouTube. Okay, Valentina, would you like me to stop sharing and hand it over to you to introduce yourself, or should I just click through for you?
If you wouldn't mind just clicking through for me, that'd be great.
I don't mind at all. All righty. I am going to stop my gabbing on and hand it over to you, Valentina, to go ahead and introduce yourself in this beautiful subject.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, ILCA, and thank you everybody for being here or watching this later on YouTube. I am a sociolinguist, and so the topic of sociolinguistic awareness is very dear to my heart, and I'm just here to share with you a little bit about sociolinguistic awareness, specifically in language coaching of relocating or remote workers. And so by way of introduction, I just wanted to share that if you wanted to learn more, a little bit about me or my work, or connect with me or consult me, at some point you can join my ICNPD lab. You can look us up on the website that is listed here. If you're interested in learning more about sociolinguistics, I have taught an introduction course at Indiana University, which is completely available online at this link here. And if you're interested in participating in more research on this topic to get, most up-to-date information on this and really particular questions answered in your context, you are welcome to follow this survey link to also participate in this research down the road. So thank you, Carrie, and let's just jump in. Here is the overview of the talk that I'm hoping to share with you today. I'm going to talk about sociolinguistic awareness and the main concepts for a little bit, and then show you a bunch of examples of sociolinguistic awareness around the world. And then that will lead us a little bit more informatively into applications to current world of work and some recommendations for language coaching. So thanks, Gary. All right, let's look at some sociolinguistic awareness and main concepts a little bit one by one. There is really a lot going on there, but there are a few very important pillars of sociolinguistics. So for example, the first one is that language variation is inherent in all living or used languages. So any language that you speak that is spoken today, and they're native speakers of it, there's children born learning these languages, right? All of these languages have variation, they vary, and that is the most normal thing. So let's just keep that as something natural. Now also that leads to understanding that language behavior reflects and reinforces social dynamics. So this variation that is inherent in all languages, it exists to reflect and to reinforce social dynamics. So it could be a socially stratified society by, for example, social class or caste, and all of those social dynamics in economics, politics, etc., will be reflected in how different people speak differently based on their social affiliation, their social status, their context, their mobility, etc. And that brings with it evaluation. So language in itself isn't good or bad. Neither language is worse or better than any other, but it is true, just as it is a social concept, there are evaluations that are attached to different ways that we speak. So different forms in which we vary our language may represent our identity. They may reflect our local markers, where we are from, where we have lived, with whom we are talking. And then some, on the more extreme side, would also have some stigma or prestige attached to these different language variants. So for example, the identity and local markers don't necessarily have this necessarily positive or negative evaluation attached to them. Stigma and prestige do. The others simply indicate who you are, where you come from, and so on. And so understanding all of that leads us to a lot of theories really in sociolinguistics, but the two that I would really like to touch on today are audience design and communication adaptation theory. In audience design, which is Alan Bell's 1986 theory, basically says that when we talk, we take into account who is our audience, and not only the intended audience, but also potential eavesdroppers, etc. So we do manage the way we speak based on how well we understand who our audience is, who might hear us. And in communication adaptation theory, it is sometimes called CAT for short. There are two main concepts that I'd like to also highlight, which is assimilation and dissimilation. And so different people understanding that there is variation and the different people speak differently might sometimes assimilate to their audience and sound more like the other person for various reasons, usually to fit in, to be liked, to be understood better, or they can sometimes consciously or subconsciously dissimulate and sound different, perhaps to show the difference in social class or the difference between my group and your group, etc., or to be rude, or sometimes not. But there are various reasons to assimilate or dissimulate to the way your context audience speaks. Those are the basic theoretical concepts here. Social networks and language change mechanisms. So this is interesting because this theory came into place before digital social networks, but it still applies today into digital social networks. It says that language change, which is very inherent in all living languages, right? It happens because of different ties in our networks. And usually the denser is the network, the less prone it is to change because everybody is just so stuck together. They have their rules and their ways of being. And so any new innovations in language really come into this network through weak ties, through ties, connections from people on the periphery or new people, incomers. And so that makes me think about remote workers, relocating workers that are trying to perhaps make their way into this dense network with a certain set of rules and ideologies, but they are really key members in what is language change actually. So this is very interesting to perhaps touch on as we consider sociolinguistic awareness. And there's just one more on this slide, sociolinguistic awareness and competence in applied research. For now, I'll just share that there is scientific research. There is linguistic research, applied linguistic research, social, psychological research into language acquisition, for example, how sociolinguistic awareness plays into, for example, in the world of work, how sociolinguistic awareness plays into interviews for jobs, how different people may use their variation, linguistic variation, natural linguistic variation to their advantage in job interviews, or without that awareness, they might lose out on something. There is linguistic discrimination, which is a separate topic, which we hope really with sociolinguistic awareness that we don't have to deal with linguistic discrimination, but it is actually something that does occur. With language learning, you can learn all the vocabulary in the world, you can learn all the grammar in the world, but if you don't know the sociolinguistic habits, cultural expectations, pragmatic context, then you're not as effective in your communication, really. And this is what ILCA does, right? This is what language coaching does to try and really bring you into that space where you're not just learning grammar and vocabulary, where you can actually be a competent and effective community member. So yeah, we can move on into the next slide, which is an overview of some examples that I'd like to show you, examples of this research. So I'll be citing some very interesting research just to illustrate. This is very basic. I'm not intending to be very profound in this. So if this triggers more questions for you, that's great. There's a lot more research, but let me just show you a couple of examples. I'll start with an English native variation example, then follow with Spanish native variation example. So this is variation within the context where it is native and natural, following with the second language acquisition or SLA context, with bilingual natural audience design, and we'll wrap it up with a brief mention of critical language awareness, which will lead us actually into the applications to current world of work. So let's start with the English native variation example. This is very famous research by the father of sociolinguistics, William Labov. This is the next slide. And so it is a bit old as research, but I think it is very classic. Well, all sociolinguists will say that it is quite classic. Dr. Labov studied social stratification of the R pronunciation in New York department stores. What he did is he recognized that New York is socially stratified by social classes, and that these classes are represented by different department stores. So for example, here in this visual, you see Saks, Macy's, and Klein. If you are not familiar, Saks is a more of a high-end department store, so for higher social classes. Macy's is somewhat middle social class, and Klein would be the lower social class. And the phenomenon of R is different from country to country, language to language, and time to period to period. But in this time in New York, it was actually stigmatized to delete it. So in the phrase like fourth floor, you see this R twice. And it was common to pronounce these words without the R, fourth floor, but that was stigmatized in New York, and it was more of a feature of lower social classes. And so what he did a very simple experiment. He went into these department stores and he talked to different people working there, and he asked very leading questions like, where can I find the shoe department, for example? And so the worker would reply something along the lines, including the phrase fourth floor. Very interesting comment by Linda, the British is not stigmatized. So this is a great example of how language is neither good nor bad. There is nothing inherently good about R. Neither inherently wrong about R. So all of the stigma and prestige are really attached to different social contexts and time periods. For example, right now, so obviously this would be the opposite. In Britain, for example, it is actually better to pronounce these without R's, but in New York in that time, that's how it was. So this is a very nice illustration of how sociolinguistics works. So let's move into this one. This is something that I have studied for my doctoral studies, Spanish native variation, and I'm particularly based in Mexico City. Sociolinguists are sometimes interested in very small things. In my case, I was looking at the direct object le, if you're familiar with Spanish, with reference to the formal you or usted. If you are familiar with Spanish, typically, grammatically speaking, or prescriptively speaking, to say I invite you formal, you would say lo invito, you being a male formal referent, for example. Lo invito, right? So, but we do see le invito a lot. If you're in Spain or familiar with the Spanish of Spain, that's the most normal thing in the world, but in Mexico and Latin America, it's not. In fact, in this graphic on the right with a pie chart, I'm showing you that I've only found 17% of that happening in over 200 interviews that I've conducted. So in a certain way, we're looking at this as a meaningful exception. This is something that in a language classroom, you would be taught that this is wrong. But when we see this actually happening among native speakers, we know that there must be something meaningful there. And so to make the story short, because this is a very long and complicated study, what it does show you is in this middle part of my infographic here is it shows you something about the speakers using it. So who uses it, and particularly what I found is that it was a meaningful exception for those who are socially mobile, so moving around the country in search of economic opportunities. Oftentimes these are immigrants to Mexico City from other parts of Mexico with some level of education, which is indicative of some sociolinguistic awareness, as opposed to others that may not have as much awareness. they are oftentimes more middle-aged speakers, and oftentimes they are women. So we can see that language, as I said, reflects and reinforces social dynamics. And we see this very small, meaningful exception in the language showing how the language dynamic or how the social dynamic in Mexico City is really panning out in terms of social mobility, migration for better economic opportunities. And we can move on into the next example, which would be an example of second language acquisition. This is a study by Andrew Cohen and Rachel Shively from 2007, which they have applied further on to different contexts. And I'm citing from their study and acquisition of requests and apologies in Spanish and French, impact of study abroad and strategy building intervention. So while the first two examples were really variation in one natural context, native context for all of these speakers, this is a second language context, right? So this is different. And this is in particular, I thought might be a good example to kind of start moving into the topic of relocation for some of the remote learners, even though it is obviously not the same studying abroad and relocating to work abroad or in some other context. But this is a study where we can learn something and apply to our context. So very briefly, this was a study, and the visual only shows a part of the Spanish speaking group or Spanish learning group, where a bunch of students traveled to a Spanish speaking country, but they were divided into half. The experimental group were the ones that received some special coaching, let's just call it that, the way that here might be understood, and the control group did not receive any special coaching. And they were both tested before the coaching or before the beginning of study abroad and at the end of study abroad, and the results of apologies, specific different strategies of apologies were compared to those of native speakers, Spanish native speakers, which is the column all the way to the right. And the type of coaching that was offered to this experimental group are on the left. These are the different speech act strategies that were given to them. So a sort of an intervention that was offered to this experimental group. They received some orientation, a guidebook, and they had some journaling exercises, which are perhaps some of the things that you do in language coaching. And so the arrows, red arrows to the right practically show that at the end of study abroad and with coaching, many students did approach a little bit better the native speaker strategies, the native speaker percentages of different apology strategies. And sometimes it happened even without the coaching. So for example, the second strategy of apology that is called here acknowledgement of responsibility, both groups, experimental group and control group, did increase in their percent numbers in the strategy, like acknowledging the responsibility. So from 12 to 18 and from 9 to 24, but both actually remained quite lower than the Spanish native speaker at 58% using acknowledgement of responsibility. But in terms of, for example, expression of apology, which is the first strategy listed there, the experimental group dropped some from 100 to 97. Which does lean to in the right direction of the Spanish native group at 83%. So not every Spanish native speaker always said, I'm sorry. Specifically, they used a bunch of other strategies, such as the acknowledgement of responsibility, for example, definitely offer of repair, etc. So a lot of learners had to relearn these new strategies, and coaching was helpful at some levels, and at some others, simply being in the broad context has helped people raise this awareness. Let's look in the next example, please. And the next example would be a little bit even closer to what now would be an issue for remote workers, perhaps. So this is an example of bilingual natural audience design. This was taken from a 2016 study on modular repertoires in English using social networks, a study of language choice in the networks of adult Facebook users. this is interesting because it uses digital social networks, which is we all use now. These are native German speakers. I'm sure there are a lot of German speakers here in the audience. And so this is what the table image is showing us, that even though these are all native German speakers, sometimes they initiate their social network posts in German, sometimes in English. And so the author, the researcher, wanted to evaluate and see what's happening. Why and when do these speakers post in English? When do they post in German? And what is the response? What languages do people respond to? In the boxes, we see that really the majority response is in German, even if they start posting in English. So about 66.6% of the time, even if you start your post in English, people respond to you in German. And obviously, if you start in German, a lot more respond in German as well, about 85.3%. So what is happening? Why would somebody choose one language versus the other? And this is relevant to this remote working context. If you are a multilingual company and your clients or colleagues understand you in either language, what are the motivations, or why would you choose one language versus the other? And so the author is proposing the concept of module repertoires. He says that these are repertoires that are organized into individual elements which are activated according to the demands of each interaction and its audience. But what are the demands of each interaction and its audience? For one, he's using the audience design model that I have mentioned, Bell 1984, I believe I've mistaken the year before. But it takes into account, it says that it's not the same, it's very different. The demands of each interaction would be different if you're considering just the direct addressee or the auditor or bystander, or if there are some unratified overhears. So for example, in transport and public transport, there might be overhears there, right? Or eavesdroppers, somebody who might be behind the door that you don't see and don't expect anybody to be there, but somebody is there, right? So in all of these contexts, you do consider all of these contexts to vary your speech or to select your communication method, right? However, what really defines, in this case, in this study, what really explains this interesting multilingual dynamic is the audience specification. And so he says basically, in order for audience maximization, many people decide to use English, even though that's not their native language, but they use it oftentimes for audience maximization. Most people, even if they're not native English speakers, they understand English. So that way you kind of get to wider public, wider audience, right? But why do people often respond in German? And that is perhaps because of audience partitioning or audience specification. So while the initial post might be meant to reach as wider audience as possible, the responses of the network of these people are really more directly toward the writer of the initial post and not toward other overhears or bystanders, for example. And that's why they're using German, because they know that the author of the post is really a native German speaker. So all of this is to take into consideration in email communication, for example, in remote work. So perhaps choose, a language that the wider audience might understand if that is your purpose. But the responses, what is the expected form? If it's more of a one-on-one response, well, you perhaps could choose the language that your addressee is most comfortable in. All right, let's move on to the next example, which is actually not a study, but it is a very important publication and important direction in this research that leads us into the applications to current world of work. So critical language awareness, you can look this up, it's CLA And so the same author, the same researcher from the last study, coupling up or collaborating with Amelia Tseng, a sociolinguist, do now propose really a different approach, a more critical approach to these sociolinguistic studies. They just recently published a volume, and they wrote an introduction to this volume on mobility, polylingualism, and change toward an updated sociolinguistics of diaspora. And so they invite everybody to really consider this diasporic sociolinguistic approach to help capture effective and cultural dimensions of the linguistic ties that people maintain with their places of ancestry, and how these are influenced and affected by their experiences of shared mobility. So it basically recognizes that all of the previous examples that I've shown you too, you may not, you may perhaps identify yourself with one or several of those examples, but say, but my case is more complex. It's strange. It doesn't really fit into any of the categories. And this is why they are calling for this research. Let's recognize this dynamic complexity, that this dynamic complexity applies to the issues of identity, language, place, speech community, social context, sameness and difference, language, ideology. All of these are really complex issues and also dynamic, meaning that they change and they vary from context to context, from time period to time period. With the pandemic, a lot of these things, for example, have dynamically shifted in certain ways. And so all of these issues going far beyond of just, being a language learner or going to study abroad or working abroad, we have to consider issues of immigration, refugees, diaspora, relocation, remote work, dual language and heritage speakers, especially in relation to if you relocate with your family, your children will be growing up in a very different context than you have perhaps, or maybe not. But all of these issues are really complex and dynamic. And so there is this call for further research. If you're interested, Amelia Tseng has given a lecture very recently. So this YouTube screenshot here will take you there. You can just look it up. And she works with especially heritage speakers or Spanish heritage speakers in the United States. A very nice example. You can learn more about it there. But let's talk about applications to current world of work. What does all of this mean for us? We know that the current world of work is complex, dynamic, and changing. And either or both relocation and remote work, which are not mutually exclusive, they can happen together, they can happen in different cycles. They both require sociolinguistic awareness, space work, and adaptation in both oral speech and in writing. Especially if it is remote work, there is a lot more written communication, but also video communication. Some perhaps are hybrid with face-to-face communication, right? So all of this is affected. And so if we think about relocation, for example, in a very simple way, we could perhaps equate it or say that it's somewhat parallel to the L2 context, right? To the second language context, maybe like study abroad context, like SLA, like similar to the research that I've shown on apologies. And so you might think, okay, so what we need in this context, if I am here or my language learner is there, maybe think in terms of accommodation and assimilation. So learn new markers, right? What are the identity markers? What are the local markers? What are stigma and prestige? What are ideologies of this new context, right? And perhaps adapt to different ideologies from time to time, right? So the idea of this would be somewhat fitting in, or in my favorite BBC series on Robin Hood, where everybody in the gang wanted to identify with the values of Robin Hood, they would say, "We are Robin Hood." So that's a sort of I guess, a mindset if we look at relocation as a sort of this second language context, like a new context in which you have to live, quite simplified, oversimplified perhaps. And remote work could, in very simple terms, oversimplified as well, look more like this bilingual or dual language context, where we're really focused on variation in audience design. So manage the old and the new markers, manage different ideologies, learn when to use one versus the other, for example, and a sort of a loving your neighbors or jack of all trades sort of idiomatic parallel. Not that one is better than the other or in any way, but a sort of a different mindset where you either have to sort of fit in one, adapt in the other, and just manage, kind of juggle, I guess, juggle different repertoires. But these two would really be too simplistic, too simplified. And so what really is happening in perhaps most relocation and remote work contexts would be these complex dynamics of migrant, refugee, dual language heritage issues, where we really need more of this critical language awareness, where all of this kind of is mixed together. All of this is complex and changing all the time. And so the call is really, we need more research on this. And so when you want to have answers to your questions on your particular case, this is where I invite you to participate in this sort of research. And this link takes you to a little survey where you can express interest in participating in this sort of research. And so that sociolinguists and applied linguists can really learn more from your context to answer your questions better and help others, people more like you. But I'll talk a little bit more about this in the following slides. And yeah, I think we're ready to take it to some recommendations. So these are recommendations for language coaching, both for a coach and a learner. Hopefully you're working together or with some sort of group or network. Obviously, some very obvious recommendations, right? So identify your individual context and the gaps in sociolinguistic awareness. Evaluate sociolinguistic needs and goals together. And I know that this is what ILCA really helps coaches and learners to do. Identify resources for consultation and support. And these could be published resources, but these could also be people, right? So for example, I am one resource, ILCA is one resource, and the next page will also have a whole list of other resources just to start you off. Another potential resource could be becoming part of sociolinguistic and accountability networks. There are national organizations such as Linguistic Society of America, et cetera, or my own professional development lab or the ILCA Association, right? So become part of this sort of a network where you can support each other and learn together. I would really motivate you to do research on your own case, observe, evaluate, intervene, measure, and iterate certain interventions and coaching methods. Or you can also participate or collaborate in scientific research to facilitate timely findings. So for example, you can collaborate on my research on this topic by following the same link that I've shown you on the previous slide, if you're interested. And I would like to finish the recommendations page with this quote from Dr. Amelia Tseng from my personal communication with her. She is really moving into questioning. So you and your coach, or you and your learner, you and your community, do question language attitudes and perceptions of prestige, privilege, and stigmatization in terms of global languages like English, Spanish, and Mandarin, minoritized languages, indigenous languages, right? The non-standard dialects and accents. Do question all of this. Do try to do some research and see, is there literature, is there science that backs up my ideological understanding of what is good, what is bad, what is prestigious, and what is not. And oftentimes you will be surprised by the findings of the critical language awareness. So yeah, it's always great to grow in that ideological sense. And on the next slide, I have a list of some places where you can start with this sociolinguistic awareness. So for example, as I've mentioned, I do have my entire course, An Introduction to Sociolinguistics, posted online. I'm sure on the YouTube, these could also be pasted into the comments or the description. And I run a lab on professional development, ICMPD lab. The Linguistic Society of America, American Association for Applied Linguistics are national organizations or associations. There's a French equivalent, a Mexican equivalent of these same things. I'm sure that they are equivalents in other countries where you are. There are other websites, a lot of university websites that kind of help you walk through sociolinguistic concepts such as the Language on Life Project. You can search sociolinguistics on ResearchGate, which is a publication hub where you can find authors, researchers, the freshest research, and of course, the International Language Coaching Association, where you can pair up with a coach and really take advantage of all of the wonderful resources that Carrie and Gabrielle offer you. So I think with this, I will stop here. I know we have not dived into a lot of questions. This is perhaps just an introduction to sociolinguistic awareness, but hopefully you have just a few resources to start with. And yeah, I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. And I think it's been...
Did I end the slide share?
Yeah, you did. Yes.
Okay, great.
So thank you very, very much, Valentina, for this amazing talk. And I'm sure that everyone is here and excited to be able to ask questions. I've actually got a personal question. I don't know whether you want to answer it or not, but through your studies, through your research and the reading that you've done and, you know, your extensive background, what has been the most interesting find? Can you recall that?
The most interesting find, I think in my research, while I worked with Mexican Spanish, and so in my research, I was very surprised to find these linguistic exceptions that I've shown you, where people would use the ungrammatical, quote unquote, right, ungrammatical form of speaking to actually show so much about who they are, their aspirations of social mobility, their education level, their fitting in, and really managing relationships. But, because I think one thing that I haven't mentioned about my research, that linguistic exception showed in offers and negotiations more than any other speech act. So that also shows me, okay, they're negotiating their identity, they're negotiating their lifestyles, they're negotiating their opportunities, they're negotiating who they are and their place in the society, especially if they're migrants from somewhere else. They're really negotiating to get their place, their role in the new community. And this is not something that I expected, actually. So the most interesting find is always the find that you don't expect. But once you start listening and really observing and listening and taking in what is really going on, and are open to being surprised, open to being taught, I think that's the most interesting find for me.
Right. Okay. So it's about, you know, going into this sort of research with an open-mindedness, you know, just that mindset, and saying, okay, I've got to let go of what I've learned. Now I want to see how it's actually applied in, you know, any kind of social context that you have. Right. Okay.
Yeah, and we've got some really rich comments from Julie in the chat. Julie, do you want to unmute and talk about this, or would you like me to read it?
Oh, I can talk about it. Can you hear me? This is the first time I've tested the audio. Okay.
We gotcha.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for the presentation and the resources, especially. I think one of the for me and my working with professionals, you know, we do talk about this with the learners, and often they come to us with really kind of beat down by their supervisors. You know, they're doing everything they can, they're trying, they're adapting, they've invested, they're conscientious, but of course it takes time. It takes time to adapt to new language norms. And so, you know, we can build up their confidence with the sociolinguistic awareness and aspect. And we usually start with that, you know, but the messages they're getting is that, you know, you suck. We thought we promoted you. We thought you were going to do well. You know, your emails represent the company and they're not accurate. and this is unacceptable, which is the point at which the company or the organization usually reaches out for help because they want to retain that person. So that's good. They want to invest in that person and help them. But our problem is not the learner. Our problem is always the native English speaker who's very, prescriptive in their attitude. And so we do all this intense work. We see improvement, and then we get these emails saying like, oh, well, this person still has the following grammatical errors that I've been seeing in her email. And it's those people who need this this awareness opening. And it's just kind of tricky because we're getting paid by them. And so we try to handle it, and open up awareness, but it's kind of a bit of a minefield. So I guess my question is, any advice or resources for bringing the descriptive people, the prescriptive people along, even when the learners understand, that it's a process and that, their dialect, their background is not bad.
Yeah, this is such a bomb of a question. Thanks, Julie. Absolutely. And the reason we talk about sociolinguistic awareness, because this is oftentimes not clear, not evident to a general public, right? And so this is, I think, the pet peeve of all linguists and sociolinguists, that why does nobody understand us? But this is a huge responsibility on sociolinguists' part, right? On you as coaches, I know this is a huge burden. And yeah, the world desperately needs the sociolinguistic awareness in these places. You as a coach, for now working with these workers, right? I guess another coaching element is, learning patience, learning humility, learning to have this compassion, understand that, people who judge you, right, as bosses, for example, and so on, they don't have all of the information that you do actually. So they're the one, unfortunately, in a disadvantage for not understanding the richness of the language, the richness of social dynamics and communication. But it is true that they will always impose certain ideologies. And so the question of linguistic ideologies or language ideologies is something very strong in all communities, right? And so part of this research that I'm proposing to do is actually evaluate these ideologies. So your own ideologies as a worker, right? As a worker in another language, for example, in the ideologies of the context in which you are, to see where they might be, I guess, where they might be not meeting. There is just so much work ahead of us. I do not have a good answer for you, Julie. I'm sorry. I think this is just on all of us. And this is awareness raising. This is education for all of us. I would really like to, perhaps through ILCA, through my own lab, maybe offer these sorts of training to companies. And I know some companies are more ahead than others on this. But yeah, consider language coaching for corporate, international organizations that deal with all of this. Definitely such a need there.
I have a quick comment here. I think it's in connection with, what both of you said. It's really important for the company, for the stakeholder who has this sort of judgment or their own fixed ideology of how the language should look, and confront them with, okay, let's do a 360 survey. If we're talking about coaching, a lot of people will be aware what that is. That, okay, let's have a look at the end users, the people who are actually on the receiving end of the communication of that email. And to what percentage, or on a scale of 1 to 10, how much it bothers them. And, if it's below 5, then just move on. If it's not an issue for the people who are reading those emails with the grammar mistakes or the whatever kind of, sociolinguistic aspect, then if that's an issue for the stakeholder, then they have to be working on their attitude, exactly as Julie and you yourself have said. So yeah, and then it's about, coming to terms with what we think, what our beliefs are about language, about how we see ourselves, the culture, the communication that we have. And it's very often about this perfectionism, which is very strong, especially in corporate culture. And I'll just be quiet here now.
No, I think that's a good point, Gabriella. And I'd like to add, yeah, there's not one quick and easy answer to this, but making space and having the vocabulary to discuss it with the client, even give it, like, empowering them with these terms of sociolinguistic awareness. Well, I'm sorry, but maybe your boss is lacking in sociolinguistic awareness, or there's a language ideology at play there, right? So even just like this making of space for it and giving vocabulary for it is something that can really empower the learner, right? And a great, like, my mind is blown right now. I'm like, oh, we need to be talking about this, all this. And we do talk about it, but it's so nice to have these like exact terms for it. This reminder of pulling those also into the sessions with learners and helping the learners grow, that not take it for truth. You know what I mean? Like that criticism from the boss and their own self-perception, not taking that as the truth in the situation.
I'm just looking here at the chat, and I'm just wondering if there are any comments. I know Julie has to leave now, so sorry to see, but I know we're near at the end. Any other ideas that we have here that have grown?
Amber's got her hand raised. She seems to have a burning question or comment.
This is new for me. This the idea of coaching. I've been teaching languages for years, and I work every day at Speaking Spanish. I live in Mexico, and I work in Ecuador as a remote worker. So coming from the perspective as being a language learner and making sure my business emails are grammatically correct. And so I'm seeing this from this other perspective, whereas I'm an English language coach, but I also work as a Spanish speaking worker. I think it's very important as a coach to help your client, give them the tools they need so that they can do the things properly. In my opinion, maybe I need, when I'm starting out, to have someone proofread my emails or just glance over them. Maybe I need to get Grammarly on my computer to check to make sure I'm spelling things correctly. I'm putting the accents in the right place. And so I can definitely see, as a coach, we want to empower our language learners and make them feel good about what they're doing and understand that there is a learning curve. But at the same time, we also want them to, in my opinion, this is my opinion, we also want them to feel like they can get to the point where they're representing the company in a good way. So I don't know, correct me please if I just don't have the full perspective on this.
I think you're totally right. I think what is also important, so as an extra pillar, adding to what you said, Amber, is that the client needs to understand when they come to the point that they feel confident enough to let go of a lot of the inhibitions and a lot of the stress factors that maybe their own stakeholders are pushing upon them, like, you need to learn more grammar because this is not good enough, and throwing back. I was working with a client once who actually had her superior checking her emails at the beginning of our course together, and at the end she said, well, actually, she said they're okay now. And all we didn't work on grammar. I do not do that. When I'm coaching, I'm not focusing on language. But we looked at structuring, logic, and clarity, and what expectations the receivers of the messages have. And I coached her around those and came up with a few, new panels, so to say. But that was not the main thing. It was the thinking behind the message. And I think that also has a very strong area to be, researched. And this changed, and the stakeholder who sent her to this course obviously said that, well, I think this course is saving me time now. So that was a really good compliment, So it's very often it's about time and energy and, how much effort it takes. If it's Grammarly, then it's Grammarly. If that's going to help the client, I have clients with Grammarly, fine. It's okay. Yeah, absolutely. Valentina, any closing comments? I don't know whether we've got anything else in the chat Carrie, if you see anything, but I think these are kind of things that we have here. Yeah.
Yeah. Nope. Nothing else coming in.
Nothing else. Yeah. Okay. Valentina, closing thought.
I would just, I guess, I hope that you would get out of here that whatever context you're in, it is complex and it is dynamic and changing. And so basically, we do need to recognize that there is some sort of adaptation that needs to happen, and that the reality of the thing is that language ideologies do vary in the context in which you are. So perhaps learning about these language ideologies, but also educating yourself through, for example, studies that I have shown you that kind of give you these tools to communicate with others and say, well, first you believe that language variation is something natural and that it can be very beneficial, right? The way you change language from audience to audience, and maybe perhaps showing that client reception, if you write emails to your clients, even with grammatical mistakes or whatnot, client reception is very positive just because of, the pragmatics that you put into it, like the care for the client, et cetera. Those mistakes, for example, don't matter as much. So if you can show, you yourself believe that first, right? And show that to your employer, you're really educating them through your own case. But it would be really nice to really do some case studies on your own case, right? So evaluate your situation, maybe perhaps try something new, evaluate it again, see how this is working, share it with somebody, share it with the researchers. Once again, I invite all of you to participate in this research for me to help you answer these questions for yourself a little bit better. That would be great. And yeah, don't do it by yourself. Try to really find a community, a network, either through ILCA, through a language coach, through some sort of an association. Find me on LinkedIn, connect with me, connect with Carrie, connect with Gabriella, and anybody else who's here. I think it would be very nice for all of us to connect and create a sort of a support network, and that way to encourage each other and help our learners and help ourselves to educate the world.
Oh, beautiful. Can't really add anything to that. So let's all connect. Yes, definitely. And let's continue the conversation at some point. So thank you very much for also being considerate of the time. I know everyone has very, very tight schedules. So thank you very much, Valentina. This will be recorded. It will be on our YouTube channel. So if you want to check or share with friends, colleagues, then do go ahead. Sign up to to our what can that YouTube channel, what else we've got, newsletter, members only zone, courses.
Yeah, we've got a community for ILCA.
Definitely.
Our courses. Check us out on the website. It's all there. free resources, not free resources, in-depth training, all of it.
Definitely. Okay. So thank you very much, everyone, again, for joining us Monday afternoon or Monday morning, depending where you are, Monday evening. Thank you all very much. And